My name is Paul Oberland. I'd like to welcome you to this introduction to our study of the prophets. The prophets were God's messengers to a wayward people. I hope we'll keep in mind that our study is not so much the prophets themselves, but rather to see them as a lens helping us to understand God better. So it is really a study of God as experienced by the prophets. A.W. Tozer, in his book Knowledge of the Holy, has made some perceptive observations, and I find them useful as we start this study. For example, consider this. He writes, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Tozer would suggest that if we wanted to get to know someone else, the best thing we can find out about them is, what do they think about God? And the same thing is true with them getting to know us. As they find out what we think about God, they will be learning the very most important thing about us. He goes on to write, the most portentous fact about anyone is not what he at any given time may say or do, but what he or she in his deep heart conceives God to be like. As we walk through this study, more than simply gaining information about the prophets or some of the dilemmas that ancient Israel went through, I would encourage you to often revisit your mental concept of God and see how it compares to how God is being revealed. Because a major problem that the Israelites ran into is they held one notion of God, which was out of sync with the reality of who God was. And as they pursued their own notion of God, it led them off the rails. And so God had to send messengers to say, you've got the wrong idea about me. And he would afresh reveal his character to them. Here's another statement by Tozer. He writes, the essence of idolatry, and that's a problem that Israel got into, as I'm sure you're aware. The essence of idolatry is the entertainment of thoughts about God that are unworthy of him. When I first read that, I was struck by Tozer's insight. Idolatry is not limited to giving adoration to some inert statue, some lifeless form, although that's one form of idolatry and perhaps the classic or the original concept that we have. But Tozer broadens it to say, just as what was wrong there was entertaining a notion about God that was unworthy of him, such as confining him to some shaped piece of granite or to a mountaintop piece of topography, so we, as we entertain thoughts about God that are less than him or aberrant from him, that today constitutes idolatry. He goes on to say this. In addition, the idolatrous heart assumes that God is other than he is, in itself a monstrous sin, and substitutes for the true God one made after its own likeness. There are 8 questions that this introductory lecture is designed to begin to address, and let's take a look at them first so you'll know what's coming up. First of all, why? Why did the role of prophets come into being? Second, we'll look at the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, look at the collection there, and ask the question, how are they classified within that collection? Third, the pre-classical origins, and a little later we'll define that term, but we'll ask what were the pre-classical origins of the Israelite prophetic movement. Fourth, what labels identified the prophets, particularly in the Hebrew itself? What were some of the terms? These can help us appreciate what their role involved. And as no doubt you're aware, there were not only true prophets on the scene, but also false prophets. So we'll begin to become acquainted with the tension that operates there. Looking ahead to the New Testament, how did Jesus view the prophets? Number 7, what sort of challenge should we be preparing ourselves for in the study of the prophets? For it is a considerable study. And finally, how can we individually gain the most from the prophets? Let's look at the first. Why did the role of the prophets come into being in the first place? Harry Orlinsky, in his book Interpreting the Prophetic Tradition, quotes from some much earlier Jewish writers in the Nedarim 22. And this is what he finds there. One of the rabbis declared, if Israel had not sinned, they would have received only the Pentateuch and the book of Joshua. Can you imagine the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, being that brief? Well, according to the Nedarim, that's all that would have been needed if Israel had not sinned. Orlinsky goes on. A sinless Israel would have been one of those happy nations that have no history. Well, we can insert, certainly they would have had a history, but they would not have needed to have recorded the waywardness and the corrections and the exiles that became part of Israel's history. The prophets were sent to warn the people against disobedience and to threaten them with disastrous consequences if they did not amend their ways, and to comfort them after disaster had struck. That's from Orlinsky. Well, as you and I know, because of her disobedience, Israel does have a history, a record of a nation that at times was doing well, but too often was careening down the pathway of time, often ignoring the warning signs posted by God's prophets. As they disregarded those signs, they wound up glancing off the guardrails of God's law, occasionally blundering over the edge, tumbling into captivity, from which disaster a remnant would eventually be airlifted back onto the path to try yet again to continue the incredible experiment of being the people of God. Now let's look at the classification of the books of the prophets. Let me correct that. As soon you will see, it's not simply the classification of the books of the prophets, such as when there is a book named for a prophet, but some of these classifications will reach beyond that. There are 3 classifications that we'll look at. First, the Jewish, then literary, and third, the historical classification. Let's look first at the Jewish classification. Perhaps you've heard the Hebrew Bible referred to as the Tanakh. That's an acrostic which accounts for the 3 major sections into which our Jewish friends have recognized or divided the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. The first is the Torah. That would be the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, also known as the Law. The second section is the Nevi'im, which simply is the Hebrew for the prophets, just as Torah is the Hebrew for law. We'll expand on the prophets in just a moment. The third portion of the Hebrew Bible is known as the Ketuvim, which means the writings, and that encompasses things such as Psalms and Proverbs, and also some books like Daniel and Esther and Chronicles. Let's zero in on the various prophets that we find in the Nevi'im, in the Jewish classification. They're grouped into former and latter prophets. Now, former prophets would be analogous largely to what in the English Bible is often designated as the historical books. For example, Joshua and Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. We consider these often in English Bible classification as historical. We don't generally think of them as prophets, although in some of them prophets do occur. You can see exceptions, that is, books which in the English Bible we consider historical, but which are omitted from the classification of the former prophets. They show up in the Ketuvim, in the writings. They're still in the Hebrew Bible, in the Jewish classification. They're simply not labeled as former prophets. The Nevi'im, the Jewish classification, continues with the latter prophets, and these would be more recognizable to us as belonging to the prophets. These are the writing prophets, although Daniel and Lamentations will not be included in these in the Jewish classification. But your standard, your Isaiah, your Jonah, your Zechariah, Malachi, these would be in the latter prophets. Let's move from the Jewish classification to the literary classification. And here we'll want to distinguish non-literary and literary. Now we're working with many of the same books and portions of the Bible as in the last one. This is simply a different way of carving the pie. Non-literary, this addresses what about a prophet like Samuel. Certainly he's a prophet, but he doesn't have the book that's named by him. He does have a book named for him, doesn't he? 1st and 2nd Samuel, but it's not strictly his ministry. It's not limited. It's not so much a book of Samuel in that fashion. It covers much more, a lot more of the history of Israel. Take another prophet. How about Nathan? Nathan served during David's monarchy and came up against him, correcting him at times or encouraging him at other times. He does not have a book devoted to him, a book by his name. He's considered a non-literary prophet or pre-classical. Literary prophets or classical prophets refer to prophets who left a book of their oracles, their sermons, left that behind with their name on it. There was a book that came into being with their name. The last way to classify is the historical pattern, and we'll be following this more directly. That is to say, the sequence of this study will not follow the Bible book order. It will rather attempt to go in chronological order, the historical order. So let's take a look at how the prophetic books play out, how they're organized along this line. There's a resource that you see on the screen before you that can be helpful. I've assembled this from a variety of sources in order to make it easier to picture the flow of time over against the prophetic books that we have. When you open that, you'll see a display like this, although it won't have the colors that I've added to this particular copy. The third column from the left is the one that you'll find especially useful. This is the one where the prophets are named. I've coded it yellow in this particular copy. Adjacent to it on the right gives us a history of the Israelite nation. And at the point when it's still united, the beginning portion, it's in this column, the fourth column over, that you'll find those records. So, for example, the founding of the monarchy, Saul and David, that appears in that tan column, the fourth column from the left. Parallel, or just alongside the yellow, the Israelite prophets, here just to the left of it, the Israelite nation, particularly the northern kingdom, is listed. So we find, once the kingdom divides after Solomon, we find the northern kingdom, the various monarchs being listed there in the purplish column. You'll notice that there are some names that are given in italics and some are in standard type. Italics refer to, in the case of the kings, it's kings of the southern kingdom. In the case of the prophets column, you'll find that the italics indicate a prophet who primarily served the southern kingdom. So just associate italics with the southern kingdom and you'll be in good shape. The remainder of the prophets would have been serving the northern kingdom. One other bit of information that can be helpful to us. You'll notice that some of the kings of the northern kingdom are underscored in a broken line. The dotted underscoring indicates that there was not a smooth succession of power at the end of their rule. There was a hostile overthrow. So, for example, towards the top of your screen, in the transition from Nadab in about 908 to Baasha, there was a hostile overthrow at that point. Same from Tibni to Omri. There was a hostile overthrow that brought Omri to the throne. Notice that those do not appear in the southern kingdom. They were not the hostile overthrows. Let's go to page 2. We continue the history, particularly beginning Jonah will be the first one that's listed here, going with an early dating of Jonah. Some will date Jonah much later, but if we take as an early date, he'll be the first prophet, and then Amos, and then Hosea. You'll notice that going from left to right, the row is colored tan. We're wanting to draw attention to a new historical era. In the tan oval, the Neo-Assyrian era prophets is highlighted. What we're indicating here is that during the ministry of these prophets, the major international player, the big strength on the block, was the Assyrian Empire. It's known as Neo-Assyrian because there was an earlier Assyrian kingdom, and then a period of dormancy, and then this revival, a renewal of power for the Assyrian era, so for the Assyrian Empire. So it's known as the Neo-Assyria. Oftentimes in these lectures, I'll, for simplicity's sake, just refer to it as the Assyrian Empire. Please understand with me, it's more technically the Neo-Assyrian era. Now, since we've colored all these columns in tan, it might lead to the incorrect assumption that these prophets, these Israelite prophets, were primarily traveling to Assyria and serving. That is the case with Jonah. However, for the rest of them, we're simply acknowledging that in the politics of that day, Israel had their attention drawn over to Assyria, and finally, as you see in the Northern Israelite Nation column, the gray box referring to the fall of Samaria, it is the Assyrians who finally do in, who finally vanquish northern Israel in 721. The reason Samaria is mentioned is that Samaria was the capital of northern Israel, and they fall to Shalmaneser or Sargon II, who was leading the Assyrians. The next band, or the next row, colored in light blue, you can see it headed there inside the oval as the Neo-Babylonian era. Once again, we're not saying that all these prophets served in Babylon. We are saying that Babylon was the major international player that Israel had to pay attention to. And eventually, when southern kingdom of Israel fell, as you see in the fourth column over the gray box, Jerusalem fell in 586, some will list it as 587, to Nebuchadnezzar, and he is leading the Babylonians. And it's for that reason that we categorize this entire span of Israelite history, particularly the prophets of this era, as Neo-Babylonian era prophets. Some of them actually will operate in Babylon. For example, Ezekiel. Ezekiel is operating in Babylon on location with the exiles, the Israelite exiles. The last era that we'll be focusing on is the colored in green here, the row that's headed the Persian era prophets. Daniel, Zechariah, down through Malachi. Basically, it's the remainder of the prophets. Reason being, Babylon falls in 539, as you see here towards the right, falls in 539, and the power that comes into play at that point is the Persians. So we designate this the Persian era. This then gives us an idea of the historical classification. The next few slides will indicate who are the writing prophets, or classical prophets as we know them, that operated during these eras. So you see Jonah, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah, once again going with an early dating of Jonah. This representation, there's a slight rose shading on this map, which indicates for us the range of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Its capital, Nineveh, roughly there in the middle. Here is one of the massive statues that was part of the grandeur of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. This, incidentally, is in the British Museum in London. Neo-Babylonian then followed, as we saw earlier from the chart, with the following prophets: Zephaniah and Habakkuk, Jeremiah, and we'll be attributing Lamentations to him, Nahum, Ezekiel, and Obadiah. The Babylonian Empire covered much the same territory as did the Neo-Assyrian, with its capital in Babylon. That leads us to the Persian era with Daniel, Haggai, Zechariah, Joel, and Malachi. Interesting side note on Daniel: our Jewish friends will not include Daniel in the latter prophets. They'll rather put him in the collection known as the Writings, along with books like Ruth, Psalms, and Proverbs. And the reason seems to be, technically, Daniel was not a prophet. He was actually a bureaucrat. He was a high official in the courts of the East, outside of Israel. However, we know that he does engage in prophetic ministry, and so we will be treating him on the more standard classification from the English Bible as one of the prophets. The yellowish area, particularly moving through the crescent, indicates the range of the Persian Empire, with its capital far off to the east in Persepolis. Now let's move to question 3. What were the pre-classical origins of the Israelite prophetic movement? You see, in this course, we will not be covering all of the people in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, who were labeled as prophets or served in that fashion. We'll really be dealing with those from the Neo-Assyrian era forward. So we won't be treating Samuel, for example, or others of that sort. The first figure to be labeled as a prophet was Abraham. You'll find in Genesis 20, verse 7, it's said of him that he was a prophet. And God says to one of the kings of the area, ask Abraham to pray for you, and then things would be corrected. When we come to Moses, we find the contours of the ministry of a prophet defined in very, very rich strokes. He is very much the archetypal Israelite prophet. Here are some of the features that stand out to us from Moses and the prophetic aspect of his ministry. He was commissioned by God. We'll find this for other prophets. Oftentimes it's referred to as a call. When he was taking care of sheep near Mount Sinai for his father-in-law, we can read of his call. He was an interpreter of historical events from a divine perspective. A prophet explains the meaning of current events according to God's purposes. For example, disaster may be explained by pointing out that a people has incurred God's displeasure through national sin. And he will go on to explain that God wants to bring the people to repentance, sometimes through a difficult experience of chastisement. In Moses' case, Moses interpreted the plagues of the plagues of Egypt. Even before they occurred, he indicated they would come, and he explained that God was sending a message to Egypt. A prophet is an exponent of ethical and social concern. Routinely, prophets will challenge the abrogation of ethical standards, whether it's an individual who's gone wrong, such as David, the individual, his involvement with Bathsheba, the prophet Nathan comes up against him, or at times it will be an entire nation which has gone sideways. Think of Amos prophesying against the northern kingdom, or Obadiah prophesying outside of Israel against the nation of Edom. Moses demonstrates this component as he displayed ethical concern trying to rescue one of his fellow Hebrews from an Egyptian oppressor. Also, it was through Moses that God transmitted what's come to be known as the most humane and philanthropic code of the ancient world as far as the law is concerned. Forthteller and also foreteller. Prophets are characterized both by telling forth or proclaiming God's message, and also, and quite often, foretelling, telling ahead of time events as the prophets were divinely inspired. So in the case of Moses, he engaged in forthtelling, that is, proclamation, as he would decry to Israel their waywardness, such as in the golden calf incident. Foretelling may be seen in the plague prediction, saying ahead of time that these disasters will come. He would also foretell that there would be another prophet like himself that would come to Israel, Deuteronomy 18:15. And sadly, it was his role to foretell that Israel would abandon God, Deuteronomy 31:29. He writes, "For I know that after my death, you, that is Israel, will surely act corruptly, turning aside from the way I've commanded you." The last dimension of a prophet that we see from time to time is the role of intercessor. Many prophets were distinguished by their ability to obtain provisions from God in response to their prayers. Were it not for the intercessory activity of Moses, the outcome of wayward Israel would have been vastly different. Here we're thinking of Moses pleading with God, particularly in the case of the golden calf. There are three others that deserve reference as we think about early prophets. The first of these is Miriam, Moses' older sister. Briefly, in Exodus 15:20, the writer of Exodus indicates that she was a prophetess. The second is Balaam. He is not Israelite. He comes from Mesopotamia and was employed by Balak, the king of the Moabites, to issue a curse against the Israelites as they were wandering through the wilderness. Time after time, Balaam endeavored to do so, but God prevented him. The third is Deborah, a prophetess. You can read about her in the early chapters of Judges. After Ehud died, we read that Yavin, the Canaanite, king at Hatzor, oppressed Israel, and the solution for Israel came through the inspired instructions that were delivered through a woman who was a prophetess. The prophets who did not leave behind a book by their name, but served during the monarchy, include the following. Samuel, we've referred to already. Nathan served during David's monarchy. Elijah served during Ahab and the monarchy of Ahaziah in the northern kingdom. Elisha followed Elijah, served during the kingships of Ahab through Joash, once again, northern kingdom. Micaiah ben Imlah, under the reign of Ahab, a courageous and spunky prophet. And then there's the prophetess Huldah, during the reign of Josiah in the southern kingdom. Come with me briefly to Israel, particularly the Temple Mount, where the prophetess Huldah is memorialized in a gate that faces south. What we see along the dotted green line are the walls of the Temple Mount. Focus in particular, if you would, on the portion in blue, the southern wall. The segment that's inside the cyan rectangle are steps that approach the southern wall. Here are those same steps. If you'll use as a point of reference this even smaller portion within the cyan rectangle, it will help you with the next photo to be oriented. Where the vertical lines are, you'll find a fencing that will help you orient. The next photo will be where the purple square is located, and our view will be oriented towards the arrow up, directed towards the southern wall of the Temple Mount. These steps, particularly the older ones that show more sign of age, actually are the steps from Jesus' era. Notice on the right the fencing that was a reference point earlier on. And now we will be climbing the steps towards where the tourists are looking more closely at a portion of the wall. It's a portion hidden by the stairs just now. This is that same wall. And these are known as the Hulda Gates. I do not have information exactly how they earned that name, but it's a beautiful memorial to a woman who spoke the truth concerning God's pending judgment because the southern kingdom had ignored God's law. Now let's turn to question 4 and explore some of the Hebrew terms for prophet. The prophets are often referred to as chozeh, which is a Hebrew term meaning a seer, someone with a capability of perception or vision. It comes from the verb to behold. We see it, for example, in Isaiah 1:1. The vision, that is the chazon, a related term, which he, Isaiah, saw, chazah. Another label, ro'eh, comes from a very common Hebrew verb, ra'ah, meaning to see. We can find this used in Isaiah 9:9, 30:10. It refers particularly to an earlier time period when, as we track the progress of these terms, ro'eh seems to be one of the earliest terms that's used. Contrasting that, navi will be a more typical term used later on. Thus, Samuel was the ro'eh par excellence. A third term, and this by far is the most common, is navi. It's related to an Assyrian term, nabu, to call or to proclaim. And interpretation varies with this term as far as exactly how we should understand it. On the one hand, it may indicate that someone has been called by God. On the other hand, it may be the prophet who's doing the calling. They are one proclaiming, calling out to others, issuing messages on God's behalf. And finally, it could mean one who calls people to God. My hunch is probably the middle one is the most reasonable understanding of this term navi as relates to the function of a prophet. Ish ha-Elohim is another designation we find in the Hebrew Bible. Simply it means a man of God, one who belongs to God for special purposes. If we turn in time forward to the period when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, the Septuagint, or LXX as it's abbreviated, will use the term prophetes, sounding very much like our English term prophet. And this has the connotation of one who tells forth a truth, proclaims a truth. Etymologically, it does not so much mean one who tells the future, a foreteller. It's a relatively frequently used term. Next, we'll examine the issue of false prophets. As we read through, particularly the biblical collection, it's easy to assume that the person speaking faithfully for God were easily recognizable. It's valuable, however, to realize that they look just like everyone else, and a person listening to them, a commoner or a king or someone in formal religious leadership, a priest, they would have to weigh the words of each prophet and determine who is speaking the truth. At times there would be more than one. There would be people contending for the attention and for the allegiance of the people. So in Amos' record, he tells of a confrontation with another prophet, Amaziah. And he tells Amaziah that he's got the wrong word, and Amaziah goes head to head, toe to toe against Amos. So there were some confrontations of this sort. Jeremiah ran into the same thing. Hananiah was a prophet who opposed Jeremiah, and it was up to the people to determine who's genuinely speaking for God. Micaiah didn't leave a book behind, but you can read of the account of this spunky prophet in 1 Kings 22. Ahab had some false prophets working in his court, and they opposed Micaiah. Micaiah took them on in a rather humorous way and explained why the message that he had was going to triumph over the false message of Ahab's false court prophets. That doesn't exhaust the confrontation of the false prophets, but gives us an idea that as we study the true prophets, there were other players on the scene that they had to contend with. Next, let's briefly encounter the question, how did Jesus view the prophets? I'm thinking here of the Sermon on the Mount as recorded in Matthew 5, where towards the end, as he's saying, "Blessed are you when people persecute you," he makes this wonderful association for those who suffer for Christ's sake. He says they will be in the group with those who were prophets and were persecuted. Consequently, he is telling us that these prophets are real heroes in his estimation, and for them there is awaiting a reward in heaven. Let's think briefly about attitudes that will help us best engage the prophets and get as much as possible out of this important study. After all, there is a large volume, just in terms of literature. There's a large volume which we're undertaking to study. It accounts for roughly 28% of the entire Hebrew Bible. That's a very large chunk. Along with that, there's considerable variety in these documents. There are some 16 writers, so we are getting acquainted with not just one writer, but at least 16, and some would argue more. For each of these writers, we will need to grasp their historical context. We will need to get used to their literary style and appreciate, at least in summary form, the impact and content of their messages. Through this, then, we'll need to attempt balance. On the one hand, we'll invest considerable energy in background studies. What was going on in Jeremiah's era? What was going on in the era of Amos? What kind of a person were these individuals? Background studies. On the other hand, we will want to take time for textual studies, not simply doing the background work, but immersing ourselves in some portions of these books to taste them, to savor them, to listen to the impact of their sermons, their rhetoric, to appreciate how God's heart was beating through them in the messages that they articulated. How can we gain the most from this study, from the prophets? Heschel writes in his introduction to the prophets, "The situation of a person immersed in the prophet's words is one of being exposed to a ceaseless shattering of indifference, and one needs a skull of stone to remain callous to such blows. Their words are onslaughts, scuttling illusions of false security, challenging evasions, calling faith to account, and questioning prudence and impartiality. I appreciate so much Abraham Joshua Heschel and the sensitivity that he's developed as he's endeavored to study and read the prophets from the inside, not simply from an academic external viewpoint, but to immerse himself in them. And so I hope you'll take seriously his caution and his invitation. Brace against this sledgehammer blows of the prophets. Incidentally, if as we read we are not hearing the sledgehammer blows, we are probably not reading with sufficient empathy. We're not getting inside the message. We should be inspired, secondly, by their courage. Again, referring to Heschel, quoting from Heschel. The prophet, and listen to the courage, the prophet was an individual who said no to his society, condemning its habits and assumptions, its complacency, waywardness, syncretism. His fundamental objective was to reconcile man and God. And why? Heschel asks, do the two need reconciliation? Perhaps it's due to man's false sense of sovereignty. Certainly that puts us out of touch with God, doesn't it? Due to his abuse of freedom. Due to his aggressive, sprawling pride, resenting God's involvement in history. The prophets were courageous. Be inspired by that. We can model ourselves after the prophets. At times, they will soar into the heavenlies. Ezekiel and Daniel do this. At other times, they find themselves simply puzzled by the message which God is giving to them. Daniel and also Zechariah will express this. There are other days when the prophets, as called, as chosen, as inspired as they are, will sink into deep despair. Jeremiah certainly does this, at one point, for example, resenting the day of his birth. Some of the prophets will try to outrun God. Consider Jonah. Or with Habakkuk, will, in essence, sit God down and take him to task, questioning his fairness, somewhat like Job, and happily listen to his answer and emerge with a faith, a sterling faith that is a tremendous model to emulate. We can gain the most from the prophets as we learn from their ethical sensitivity. Listen to Heschel once again. They speak and act as if the sky were about to collapse because Israel has become unfaithful to God. But in contrast, our eyes, and he's thinking of us as moderns, our eyes are witness to the callousness and cruelty of man, but our heart tries to obliterate the memories, to calm the nerves, to silence our conscience. We need to learn from their ethical sensitivity. Prophecy, Heschel continues, is the voice that God has lent to the silent agony, a voice to the plundered poor, to the profaned riches of the world. It is a crossing point of God and man. God is raging in the prophet's words. And I hope during this study that we will find ourselves sensitized in a new way to the ethical priorities of God. So we want to read empathetically to get the most from this study. Hear Heschel again. It is not enough to have the prophets in mind, he writes. We must think as if we were inside their minds. For them to be alive and present to us, we must think not about the prophets, but think in the prophets, with their concern and their heart. Their existence involves us. Unless their concern strikes us, pains us, exalts us, we do not really sense it. We are interested in restoring the world of the prophets, terrifying in its absurdity and defiance of its maker. A world tottering at the brink of disaster, and with the voice of God imploring man to turn to him. It is not a world devoid of meaning that evokes the prophet's consternation, but a world deaf to meaning. And so for us it is to hear from God and then speak to God, for that is what the prophets did, and we want to emulate them. First to hear from God, and then on his behalf, after we've heard him deep within, to speak for God. We will find him, we will hear him as a God whose compassion towards those outside his covenant will expose ugly bigotry within us. I'm thinking here of Jonah, for very much that is a prophecy to the prophet, more than it is a prophecy to other people, exposing the brokenness and wrong thinking within Jonah. We will discover God revealing himself as a God whose commitment to justice endears him to all the oppressed and sends him raging against those who feel their wealth and their power set them above the law. Here I'm thinking of the messages of Amos. We will find God revealing himself finally as the God whose love for the wayward is so prodigal, so generous beyond bounds, that he would seem to wed them to himself, becoming engaged to them again, even though they have become wayward and prostituted themselves, if only they would turn to him. Perhaps you recognize that as the message of Hosea. Beautiful, priceless message. So I invite us to brace ourselves to hear God inviting us to leave a vision of his holiness in the sanctuary. After that point, as Isaiah had a vision of God's holiness in the sanctuary revealed to him, God will be inviting you to come to that vision, to get to know him better, and then to leave it, to leave the sanctuary, and to invade our own cultures with a distinct, a challenging, a winsome word from God. Here then are the questions that we've talked about in this introduction. First, why did the role of the prophets come into being? The books of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, how are they classified? What were the pre-classical origins of the Israelite prophetic movement before we come to the classical, that is, the writing prophets? We looked at a number of the terms from the Hebrew Bible that identify the prophets. We thought about the false prophets and Jesus' esteem for them. Toward the close, we consider the challenge of undertaking this study and steps we can take to gain the most from the study of the prophets.